As I'm sure you can tell by this channel, I'm a person who has a completely normal amount of interest in things a lot of the time, and that very normal level of interest often drives me to seek out any new information about things that I'm interested in. I've been checking Cerebi.net every day since age 10 as an avid Pokemon fan, and since getting into A Song of Ice and Fire, I've often found myself checking George R. R. Martin's Not a Blog in order to find any potential shred of information on the Winds of Winter. Today, I want to discuss one particular post from George Martin's Not a Blog. Not one that has anything to do with the Winds of Winter, but one that gives us great insight into his writing and publication process, and pretty much sums up the entirety of his journey with the last book in the series and what it took to get A Dance with Dragons published. Today, I'm taking a look at the blog post entitled Talking About the Dance, which covers the journey from A Dance with Dragons' initial inception to its eventual publication in July of 2011. Before discussing the contents of this post, it's important to discuss its timing and what exactly that means for it and the process it takes to get this information. Specifically, we know that A Dance with Dragons was initially intended to be published within a year of A Feast for Crows publication. That was delayed for a number of reasons that we'll get into later in this blog post, but later in 2011, on March 3rd, George R. R. Martin announced the release date of A Dance with Dragons for July 12th of that year, that being 131 days after the initial announcement of publication. This blog post comes from May 19th, which is about the halfway point between A Dance with Dragons' announcement and eventual publication. It is worth noting that the publication announcement and the publication date are 131 days apart. So, given that, that's roughly the time frame that it would take to announce any other similar book in the future. Not that it seems particularly likely that a Winds announcement will come anytime soon. Just worth stating that many people often think that editing and getting the book finally pushed out to publication is this super long process, but we do know exactly how long it took George on the last book in this same series. The first part of this post goes into explaining what exactly has been going on since the announcement of A Dance with Dragons publication. Specifically, that Martin has continued to work on the novel even since then. He does specify that at the time of this post specifically, being May 19th, he is completely 100% done. But he does go into the fact that he was not 100% done when he announced the publication date of Dance. He still had a number of final chapters to deliver, in addition to some final rounds of edits and creating things like the appendices. These things take a fair bit of work, and it seems as though that was the bulk of what he did for these months in between the actual announcement and the publication of the book. But it is interesting to get insight into exactly what happens after the publication of a book is announced and what is going to have to happen before that book is actually going to be brought to the people. From there, he moves into a bit of a reflection on the text itself, first going into the writing process and then some details even of the plot and the characters. He's very specific to give a spoiler warning, which on initial read I was surprised to find that there are in fact spoilers in here. You can pretty clearly puzzle out at least one major twist of Dance with Dragons just by reading this single blog post that was released 2 months before the novel was. So I think it's pretty interesting to see that, and I think that if he were to do something like this with Winds, it would be immediately hyperanalyzed, and I'm curious as to whether or not that was the case when this blog post was actually published. I don't actually know. I was 11 when this blog post was posted. No, I was 10. Oh, wow. I'm old. Sorry. Martin begins by stating that A Dance with Dragons weighed in at 1,510 manuscript pages at the time he was finished with it. He writes on WordStar in this very old-fashioned computer, so it adds a few more when it's transferred to a Word file, but overall it's one of the largest books in the series, I think only coming in behind A Storm of Swords by about 10 or 11 pages. We know now that The Winds of Winter is going to greatly exceed A Dance with Dragons' initial manuscript page count. Martin has stated, I believe in the interviews he took after the first season of House of the Dragon, that he plans on The Winds of Winter being at least about 1,600 manuscript pages long. There is an issue with that, though, and that is brought up in this post. Specifically, Martin says that if you pass the 1,700 page count of manuscript pages, you cannot bind a book into a single volume. That'd be interesting for The Winds of Winter, as it does seem likely that being such a massive book, it could pretty easily cross that threshold, especially given that Dance was so close in itself. If that were the case, Martin has expressed that he's not really sure how it would be split up, but rather he'd leave that to his publisher. However, he has stated he's not open to splitting it like Feast and Dance, but rather hopefully splitting it into two books, maybe one published in one year, the other the subsequent year. Martin then details two tactics he uses to keep his books shorter than they would be otherwise. He notes that Dance was creeping towards that limit of 1,700 words, so he ended up trying to use two tactics in order to cut it down. The first of these we know pretty well from just his interviews and a few sample chapters from The Winds of Winter, but it's specifically that he cut a number of chapters from A Dance with Dragons and moved them to The Winds of Winter. We know that was the case with at least Elaine and the Forsaken chapter from The Winds of Winter, and likely Ariane's as well. But overall, it could be the case that there were more chapters intended for this book that did not fully make the cut. Additionally, he talks about his quote unquote sweat. This is a tactic he picked up when he was a screenwriter in Hollywood, and it's something that if I ever write, which I would kind of like to at some point, I hope to adapt into my own form. Specifically, given the fact that he essentially is able to trim down words just by looking at a page and seeing what is essential there. He says, quit trimming the fat and leaving the muscle from his work. I really like that turn of phrase, and I think that turning a work into something more succinct is kind of a dying art form, and I'm excited to see the ways in which Martin does that in comparing his initial drafts to the final published product, as the drafts are listed as being stored in a library in Texas, which we now know is accessed by people like GSteph, as has been specified in numerous videos. Martin then elaborates on some details regarding viewpoint characters. There are 73 chapters in Dance, and he states that they're viewed through the eyes of 16 different characters. He doesn't tell us who those characters are, but he does tell us who those characters aren't. He specifically states that Sansa, Sam, Aeron, Arianne, and Brienne have no chapters in A Dance with Dragons. He does specify that some of them did have completed chapters that were moved to wins, but he does say that those four, five, six, I miscounted, it's five, do not have any chapters in this book, similarly to how some characters like Jon and Dany did not have chapters in A Feast for Crows. Speaking of those two and Tyrion make up a massive portion of A Dance with Dragons. He specifically states that 35 chapters of the 73 concern these three characters, which is a massive portion of this book. It's really proportionally just vast as compared to really any other group of characters in any other book in the series so far. The three protagonists here. This is where we get into the spoiler I mentioned earlier. He mentioned the next largest chunk of point of view chapters belongs to an old viewpoint who's been missing for a couple of books, but now returns to us rather worse for wear. Later on in the next paragraph, he specifies that there will be three Ironborn viewpoints, all of which have been seen in previous novels. He did specify in the previous paragraph that Aeron Damphair will not appear in The Winds of Winter as a viewpoint, so with that, we know we have two Ironborn left over from A Feast for Crows, those being Asha and Victarion, and Theon, who is at this point assumed dead, is by this blog post confirmed to have survived. He's the only other Ironborn viewpoint character, and we do not know his fate as of A Feast for Crows. We know that in A Storm of Swords, Robb is sent a piece of his skin by Ramsay Bolton. That really doesn't signal whether Theon is dead or alive by the time Dance would be happening. And in Feast for Crows, we know that Cersei's small council assumes that the Ironborn prince is dead. That said, if Cersei's council is assuming something, it's probably best to assume the opposite. I'm going to be honest, if I had read this in 2011 and he hadn't included the bit about the Ironborn, I would not have assumed this was Theon. I would have thought that Catelyn was returning to a viewpoint character status. She was a viewpoint and a very important one in the first three books in the series, and her status as Lady Stoneheart would be very much worse for wear as compared to her original self. And seeing things through her eyes could have a very interesting influence on the story of Brienne and Jaime moving forward. There is one element of this post that I have discussed before, though it was a very long time ago. I think it was in my second video on the books exclusively and not House of the Dragon. That being George R. R. Martin's discussion of new viewpoint characters in this book. He states that there are 4 new viewpoints, not counting the prologue and the epilogue, and he states that he only intended on one of them initially being a viewpoint character. In that video, which I think was my one on Davos, I essentially hypothesized that one that he was going to add is Melisandre. Now that I look back on it, I'm not entirely sure that that was the case. Given how much of an important element of the story Aegon and his cause for the throne are in The Winds of Winter and likely A Dream of Spring, I would guess that Jon Connington, being the most important character in the entire series, is probably the one viewpoint that Martin did intend. We know that Barristan was invented to solve the Myronese knot, as that is discussed a bit here, but overall it's unclear as to who of the remaining 3 is the individual that Martin is essentially intending on having there from the beginning. Later on in the post, Martin details a number of drafts that he submitted to his publishers at various points in Dance's development, going from 596 pages to 684, 774, etc., gradually going up by hundreds or dozens just to kind of see the progress of this book as it gradually crawled along. He does specify a number of things that kept him from working on not a Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons, specifically promotion for Feast for Crows, seeing as there was an American book tour, a Canadian book tour, a British book tour, and a visit to Italy. I think that these things are things that should be considered in looking at what could be delaying the Winds of Winter. But when looking at his progress over the last couple years, I might not be as pessimistic as others, and I can explain exactly why that is in relation to the Winds of Winter. Martin really hasn't had a ton of press tours of late. He's been promoting House of the Dragon here and there, but unlike a book tour, that falls mostly to the actors rather than the author of the source material. Book tours require him to go somewhere and sign things and actively be the face of it, whereas for House of the Dragon, I only saw like 3 or 4 interviews that he did at the time. Additionally, people have been pessimistic based on his discussions at the end of last year, specifically when in some interview that was not related, or I think was just on the internet for something or other, it didn't seem super formal. He essentially repeated what he'd said about a year and a half prior when promoting the end of the first season of House of the Dragon. The way I personally read that is he hadn't had an estimation in a while. My thought is that he just kind of defaulted to what he'd previously said as to not falsely promise things, which he's been burned for doing in the past. And I think that overall, it seems as though he might have likely hit a snag due to some kind of just depression in personal life, as it seems as though a number of his writer friends and other individuals in his life have passed away. But it does seem like he's been more optimistic this year. We've had a number of blog posts with more positive tones, specifically over the last few months. And I think overall, these elements could be pointing towards at least some positive momentum for the book we're all awaiting. But that said, who knows? Certainly not me. Martin begins this post by declaring that Kong is dead, Kong being the affectionate title that he had given to Dance throughout its road to publication. It was the monkey on his back, and it had eventually turned into King Kong. He ends this same post by welcoming another cute little monkey onto his back, that being the Winds of Winter. The main reason I like this post is it's a fun kind of time capsule looking back at A Dance with Dragons just before it was published and walking us through exactly what it took Martin to do to get this book past the finish line. I'm so fascinated to see what exactly is going to happen when Winds of Winter is eventually published, and I think that seeing a post like this about that book would be fascinating, and I'd love to see it, and I really hope he does one if and when Winds is ever published. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a bit different than my other stuff. It's not analyzing the text of A Song of Ice and Fire, but rather a text talking about A Song of Ice and Fire, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. I like looking through Martin's old work, and I think there could be other interesting blog posts that I could kind of look my way through as well. Specifically, the Winter Garden post from a couple summers ago comes to mind. Thank you again so much for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, helps the channel a lot. You all know this. I really appreciate it, and I will be back with more videos for you in the very near future. House of the Dragon Season 2 is imminent, and I, for one, am pumped. I will see you all soon. Goodbye.